Hello everyone, this is the follow-up lecture for week 9 on W.B. Du Bois, and I just want to speak to a couple of points that I saw come up in your discussion board posts and in your discussion questions and so forth, and just to provide a little bit more information about Du Bois, because he is such an important figure. I want to talk a little bit more about some of the other activity that Du Bois did as an active scholar. Some of you did, you looked up information about Du Bois in your blogs that you posted. They were all really informative. Du Bois was active in a lot of organizations and events that were meant to sort of improve the situation of African Americans. Du Bois took part in an organization called the Niagara Movement, which occurred at the very beginning of the 20th century and which was the precursor to the NAACP. So Du Bois was very active in forming this very important social organization. So the Niagara Movement comes first, then the members of the Niagara Movement plus some others get together later and they form the NAACP. And the NAACP would go on to become one of the foremost activist organizations meant to change the conditions of black life. So Du Bois is foundational in putting that organization together. Once he would put the NAACP together, he took part in other significant events. There was an anti-lynching campaign that Du Bois was very active in at the beginning of the 20th century. Getting into the 19-teens and 1920s, Du Bois was an instrumental figure in shaping the period called the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance comes about because Du Bois and some others begin to concentrate on the arts in particular as a means of changing African American experience, as a means of speaking to and with white Americans so that the issues of racism would decline. So Du Bois was just a major, major figure, active in a lot of different areas, both sociology, the sciences, and arts. So Du Bois was all over the place and did very, very impactful and long-lasting work. So just to give you a little bit more context about the things that Du Bois did. I also suggested some other historical context that people should look at. I suggested people look at William Monroe Trotter, for example. William Monroe Trotter was an activist who was very much opposed to the work of Booker T. Washington. And Du Bois and Trotter, they worked together on some particular areas, some particular issues. Monroe Trotter might have been thought of as even more radical than Du Bois was, but the two of them were both opposed to the work of Booker T. Washington. Although, as some of you did look in his in your blog areas, Du Bois would later on talk about his relationship with Booker T. Washington, not as one of strict antagonist. Du Bois definitely thought that Washington had some information and some methods that were worthwhile, but because of the strict limitations that Washington put on things, Du Bois thought that African American politics needed to go further than that, so he worked to change that. Other historical contexts that were going on at the same time was the development or the occurrence of the Spanish-American War, which happened in 1899, when the U.S. Sent troops both to Cuba and to the Philippines in a fight against Spain. Now, this was a notable movement because it's part of the change towards modernity that I've been talking about. I mentioned that modernity includes not just these technological advancements, but it also includes different kind of political styles and political issues. And what the Spanish-American War did for the United States was it was the first move into colonialism. Now, other nations, England, of course, notably because the United States is an English colony, right? But England, France, Belgium, all these other European countries had already established colonies. And colonies were presented as a means of gaining profit for the home country. So in 1899, with the Spanish-American War, is when the United States takes its very first colonies. It moves troops into Cuba, and it moves troops into the Philippines. And those two locations become, to some extent, American colonies in the years that followed. Now this event, right, the Spanish-American War, was interesting because we have African-American soldiers still fighting in U.S. wars. So when Teddy Roosevelt goes and fights at the Battle of San Juan Hill, there are African-American soldiers that accompany him on that journey. So there are definitely things that are going on that make the turn towards colonialism by the United States impactful for African-American soldiers, African-American populations. Many African-Americans supported the war, and they have supported every war that America has been involved in because they argue that it's going to increase their standing at home. So if black soldiers go and fight in the war, the United States will not be able to take away their rights when they return. But that has been sort of the claim that they've been working with. At the same time, many African Americans have protested American involvement in war. arguing that black Americans who are treated as second-class citizens have no real need to take part in what they call a, quote, white man's war. So those are kind of issues that began coming up at the turn of the 20th century. Colonialism becomes a new political move for the United States as a whole, part of the move towards modernity. And African Americans have different views on whether black people should participate in these wars or resist these wars. So those are other kind of things that are happening at the same time that Du Bois is writing his work. To discuss some passages in particular that we looked at, I mentioned the coming of John in one of the discussion questions. It's the story at the end of Souls of Black Folk, wherein we have the character of John, who is a young black boy growing up in the South. He moves to the North, and what happens as a result of that move, and then he moves back to the South, and what happens as a result of that. It's a very moving story. So Du Bois was definitely a talented fiction writer. He wrote at least 2 novels. He might have written 3 novels. I'm not exactly 100% certain about that. But he wrote several novels as well as his essays and other kinds of scientific work. The Coming of John, I think, is a very interesting one, in particular because it emphasizes Du Bois's interest in the arts. Now, Du Bois's ideas about the arts would change over time, but at the time that he wrote Souls of Black Folk, he definitely thought that the arts in particular had a special role to play to elevate us beyond the veil. So when, in The Coming of John, the character John goes to the opera, and he sees this German opera, Lohengrin, where there's this operatic scene, and John is transported by this experience. The art world lifts him up beyond the veil, or above the veil. And this really shows Du Bois's ideas about the arts, which he would show later as he gets into the issue of the Harlem Renaissance, which I just mentioned a few moments ago. Other ideas, I've asked you guys to look at the story, The Meaning of Progress, and there are some very interesting posts there as well. Du Bois's ideas about progress from his story are very ambiguous. So he comes to the South, he sees this town and this community of black people, and then he comes back 10 years later and sees how they've changed. And although he sees some progress made, he also sees some other places where progress has been taken away. So he does not end up by stating that progress has been easy or that black people have simply moved on a direct trajectory from one state to another state. Rather, he sees a mixture of events, some positive and some negative, that become the source for that story. You guys looked at the poem We Wear the Mask in comparison to Du Bois's ideas about double consciousness. And there are some relationships between those 2 poems. Both of them are talking about people who have an inner self and an outer self. Some of you rightly point out the difference between those 2 works as well, in that in Paul Laurence Dunbar's poem We Wear the Mask is something that the individual on the inside has created. And the mask itself is not antagonistic towards the other self. Even though the mask shows a false impression of what's going on inside, the mask is not trying to harm or hurt the self inside. It's just trying to cover things up. And in fact, the narrator in that poem, I think, maybe even refers to it as something like a protection. It keeps you shielded from the eyes of the outside world. Now, Du Bois sometimes talked about the veil in terms a little bit like that. But for the most part, Du Bois talked about double consciousness as being something where you have 2 selves. One is not simply a mask of the other, but one is in fact actively antagonistic towards the other. So for African Americans, Du Bois says we have 2 personalities, 2 selves, one self, a American self, and one self, a black self. And the American self sees the black self as inferior, sees the black self as a problem to be eliminated. And double consciousness is living with these 2 conflicting attitudes within the self all the time. So there are some similarities between Du Bois's idea of double consciousness and Paul Laurence Dunbar's poem, but there are some significant differences as well. And this raises the question that was also our other discussion question, which was about how double consciousness plays in the present day. And my question was, is the term still a useful term for explaining contemporary racial experience? And almost all of you said yes, and I believe it is still as well a useful term for discussing contemporary racial experience. The issue that I wanted to point to, however, is that Du Bois, when he coins this term, he coins it specifically about African American experience. Double consciousness describes African American experience at the turn of the 20th century. And again, it is with 2 selves that are actively antagonistic towards one another. In contemporary discourse, Many of you said that what has happening with African Americans in double consciousness is the same as what happens with other immigrant experiences. So if someone comes from another country and they move to the United States, they feel the old self and they feel this new self, and those two things are in conflict with one another. I want to caution against making too straightforward of a connection between these two events. And I would argue that the experience of immigrants does not have the same exact relationship between the two selves. Particularly, I would argue that African American experience has been so discounted and so denigrated in American experience that that kind of negative portrayal is not the same as the portrayals of many other immigrants. Which is not to say that other immigrants are simply welcomed and celebrated, because that's not true at all. The United States is very critical of other immigrant groups as they arrive in the United States, and it's something which our country needs to consider. But I think that the way that African American culture is referred to in society has a different degree of criticism than we do from other kind of immigrants. I think there's some hysteria about that in the present day, but I think that there are some places where those two comparisons are not exact. And they are definitely parallel, they are definitely have some similarities, but we need to make a significant distinction between the two of them if we want to be honest about how culture plays out in the United States. I think this is kind of a difficult issue to sort of tease out all the different similarities, and one that I'm not sure that I can really get into, that I can really explore fully in this short response lecture. But I do think that there are some differences in terms of how contemporary immigrant experience and African American experience of double consciousness kind of pull apart or overlap. I think there are places where they overlap, but there are other places where they're certainly different. I'm kind of unsatisfied with that response, but I don't think that I can go into it any further at the moment. I'm already at the end of this kind of 10-minute lecture. So with that, I think I just want to bring this to a close. Thank you very much for listening to this lecture.